Hi, welcome to the slideshow and lecture for Module 8. Today we'll be talking about a group of artists known as the Bellini because they're all from the same family, and another artist named Giorgione. Now, at this point, we're actually moving outside of the central Italian tradition. So instead of looking at works primarily in Florence and Rome, we're going to be looking at the works of artists who are working primarily in Venice and the area in northern Italy around Venice on the mainland. Some of the key points that I'll be talking about today include the differences in the pictorial approach between artists from central Italy and those from Venice. And I've mentioned this once before, I think, but there's this really strong divergence between these two groups of artists in how they approach the treatment of the surface of a painting. Also, I'll be talking about the Bellini. This is a family of painters. There's 3 different Bellini we'll be talking about today. And we see them being really characteristic of the early Renaissance in Venice. That is, they're very interested in light and color, rather than the central Italian tradition of being interested in drawing or design. And in Italian, this dichotomy is referred to as colore versus disegno, so color versus drawing or design. And finally, we'll end the lecture today by talking about a few works by Giorgione, who is a rather mysterious artist. We don't really know that much about him, and we don't have that many works that can be securely attributed to him, but the primary sources indicate to us just how important he was, and the works of art that we do have by him are incredibly enigmatic and very, very interesting. So to start with, I want to give you some background on Venice, because it's quite different than what's going on in Florence and Rome. Like Florence, it is a republic, but it has a more distinct personality. They have a very unique self-image. They see themselves as very powerful, and they actually are very, very powerful. And we see them creating their buildings specifically with a combination of Gothic and Byzantine elements. So they're a major trade power, and they have interactions with a lot of different cities. So we see the influence of Byzantine and Islamic architecture, for example, as well as some Gothic elements, as we mentioned. It's not a Roman city like so many others, so it's not founded during the Roman Empire, and instead they're more connected to the Byzantine Empire, which is the later part of the ancient Romans. It's set in Constantinople. It's the Eastern Roman Empire, essentially. Venice is also famous for creating lots of legends for its history. They didn't have that Roman history, so they often made up some foundation myths for themselves. They're quite self-sufficient through trade, and the lagoon of Venice creates a natural fortification. So Venice, just to orient you, is up here in the north, right on the water. In fact, it's a whole series of conjoined islands. So we're at quite a distance from places like Florence and Rome. The closest thing we've looked at here is in Padua, which was Giotto's Arena Chapel, you may remember. So quite far north. There is definite interaction between these centers, but they've got a really independent personality. Here's a print depicting what the city of Venice looks like. It looks a lot like 2 fish taking a bite out of each other's mouths. And here you can see the lagoon around it and how anybody entering the city would have to do so by sea. So they're at a significant defensive advantage from that point of view. They had large commercial and military fleets of ships. They're headed by what's referred to as a Doge, which is a bastardization of the word duke, and the Doge is the center of civic government. They also had several different councils of nobles who made up the rest of the government. So Venice is founded at the center called the Rialto, and that is their major mercantile center. So on this map, we can see the Rialto indicated right here. This is where the earliest foundations are said to have taken place and then spread out from there. So the Rialto and the area around San Marco, which you can see right here, San Marco is their major basilica. That is the other major center of the city, because not only is the major basilica there, this is also where the Doge's palace is, and the largest open space in the city, just referred to as the Piazza San Marco, often just called the Piazza, because all other open spaces in the city are referred to as a campo, a field, so on a smaller scale. And this was the major entrance to the city. This is how every important visitor would arrive. They become a really significant power after the Fourth Crusade of 1204, where they took part in the sack of Constantinople, which led to the Doge being granted the title as Lord of Quarter and Half a Quarter of the world. So because they then had control of a large part of the Byzantine Empire. They have 2 patron saints. Their earliest one is Saint Theodore, And the second is Saint Mark the Evangelist. San Marco is named for Saint Mark, and his legend is quite important, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Myths and the sea are two very important facets of Venetian life. Venice is also very well known in the Renaissance for its skill in printmaking and in the publishing of books. And this area is one of the first to exploit the invention of the printing press. So just to orient you a little bit better on the map, the Rialto is here at number 9, right in the center. And then this 14 through 20 is the area around San Marco. You can maybe see what the city looks like a little bit better than from that print. This is a more schematic plan, a little easier to read, I think. And this plan also indicates most of the important churches in the city. And we'll be looking at a few images from different churches. We'll look at one from San Giobbe up here indicated as number 2. And we'll also be looking at a painting that came from what's indicated here as number 6, the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. So here's an image of the piazza today looking towards San Marco. That's the very large dome structure in the background. Just to the right, the sort of pink and white building behind the large brick campanile or bell tower, that is the Doge's palace over there. So you can see how integrally connected they are. So according to legend, the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist was stolen from Alexandria by 2 Venetian merchants and presented to the Doge, not the Bishop of Venice, in the year 828. Mark becomes a very important icon in the city, and you see all over the place the lion of St. Mark, this symbol that comes to be associated with that evangelist. And the idea of Mark becomes inextricable from the state. The Doge at the time had the church built, so the first church on this site dates from the 9th century. And essentially, the church becomes a display space for booty from different territorial conquests, especially the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Now, what's really interesting about this church is that it's the private church of the Doge. It is not the cathedral of the city. It is now, but that didn't happen until the 19th century. But it's a very good demonstration of where the power is in Venice, and that is with the Republican government rather than with the ecclesiastical officials. Venice is very much bound to tradition and with its associations between East and West. And we see a lot of continuity evident in their art, so earlier Renaissance styles carry over into later traditions as well. So I'm going to start today by talking about Jacopo Bellini. He is the father of the 2 other Bellini that we'll be talking about. Vasari sort of outlines that for you as well. This is an early work by him called The Madonna and Child Surrounded by Angels, or sometimes called The Madonna of the Cherubim. Many Venetian painters are quite skilled in synthesizing the varied traditions that came to impact the art in the city, that is Gothic, Byzantine, but also central Italian modes of painting. So looking to artists like Giotto or Masaccio as a point of reference. Jacopo Bellini is among the best at this synthesis of the varying traditions. He starts something of a painting dynasty. His 2 sons, Gentili and Giovanni, who we'll talk about, become very well known, and his son-in-law, Andrea Mantegna, is also very important, and Vasari talks about him as well, although we won't be covering Mantegna in this class. This painting is still in its original frame, and what we're seeing is a typical representation of a Madonna and Child, so the Virgin Mary holding on to the Christ child. He's a little bit bigger than a typical baby here, and we see that she looks sort of sad. She has these downcast eyes and a rather melancholic expression. We can consider this work rather Veneto-Byzantine, so it's similar to the earlier Italo-Byzantine style that we talked about with Cimabue and predating Giotto's work. But there are definitely some Byzantine elements here, especially with the flecks of gold throughout, picking out the frame, but also the halos of the 2 figures, as well as the halos and wings of the cherubim floating in the background around them. And we see the Virgin holding the child at a ledge, pretty much presenting him to the viewer. So we see a prayer book perched on the ledge, giving a little bit of a sense of perspective with the book and the ledge itself. And the Christ child looks out towards us and gives us a gesture of blessing. He holds a piece of fruit in his hand. And then in the background, rather than creating any sort of 3-dimensional space, which he could have because Bellini was very interested in perspective, which we'll see in some of his other works, instead he's created this very heavenly background by showing this whole series of cherubim. It's almost like a wallpaper of cherubim. And often we think of cherubim as these beautiful little angels, the chubby little ones that you often see in paintings. But instead, the way the Bible describes cherubim is they're these angels very high up in the hierarchy of angels who would just have lots and lots of wings. They're typically described as having 6 different wings. And so you see wings replacing their bodies here. So you see them almost enthroned in this heavenly setting, even though the legend, the prayer book, give it a more earthly feeling. Now the frame and then the gold within the painting as well recall the mosaics of Venice. So Venice is well known for lots of different things, including printmaking, as I said. Also, it's well known for its mosaic artists, which is something else that's coming from the Byzantine tradition, as well as its glass making. So these are all really important aspects to Venetian art and culture, and we see that translating into painting sometimes. So in this painting, we see a clear separation of the divine and the mundane. So the Virgin Mary and Christ are providing this screen separating us on the other side of this ledge. We are very distinct from their space. And we see quite a bit of naturalism going on here. If you look at the folds of the drapery, the way it hangs over the body of the Virgin and the Christ child, but it still carries many more Venetian aspects than what we see in Central Italian painting. Venice is very unique in terms of the setting of the city. So there are lots of sidewalks, as you can see in this image, but everything is on water. Nowadays, there's no cars, so it feels pretty different from a city, from a normal city in that regard. But the thing about having all this water is that the light really has a different effect in the city, and it changes throughout the day. So a building might look one way in the morning, and then based on how the sun is reflecting off the adjacent water, it would look completely different in the afternoon. And this empathy to the varying light situation really impacts Venetian artists. We see them trying to recreate these beautiful lighting effects in their works, which also relates again to those mosaics and to glass making that are 2 very important trades within the city of Venice. I've even read that Venetian artists, Venetian painters would sometimes crush up pieces of glass and mix that in with their pigments to create an even more luminous effect with their paintings. So I wanted to show you a more central Italian tradition in the work of Jacopo Bellini, because I've talked about how he's really great at synthesizing these different styles. We have many of Jacopo's drawings that survive, including 220 that are preserved in 2 volumes. They're often referred to as the artist's notebook. These are not preparatory drawings, so not getting ready for a later painting, but rather seem to be connected with his own artistic training. Artists would have purchased the paper in folio sheets, so quite large sheets of paper, it's just how they were done, and then they would have had them bound together. Paper and parchment aren't cheap, so that's one reason we don't have a lot of earlier drawings surviving, because it's not a very cheap medium to work with. Also, it deteriorates pretty easily. Jacopo Bellini's widow referred to his drawings, such as this one I'm showing you here, the Dormition of the Virgin, as drawn paintings. Now, it's important to keep in mind that at this time, there is not the same tradition of appreciating drawings as artworks in and of themselves. So that's one reason we can think of these more as part of his preparation and training. We see in this scene the Dormition of the Virgin, which is the very nice way of saying the Virgin's death. So it's like she falls asleep. Right in the center of the architectural setting, he's placed the Virgin lying on a bed, and you can see that she's even an active part of this perspectival system, as is her bed. Surrounding her are the apostles. And so that is the major theme of the work. But I think that you can tell by looking at this that that isn't the major focal point. Instead, we see Jacopo being very interested in setting up a clear system of perspective. There's a single vanishing point for all of the different areas. There's a significant recession taking place. Figures are occupying a distant middle ground from the viewer with a foreshortened recumbent Virgin. So this is a major skill of the artist, the ability to foreshorten a figure to make it look like it's lying there, to put it in this perspectival plane. I think one of the other really interesting places to see this perspective is that if you look up at this balcony that projects from this upper balustrade, you can just see the entire bottom of it. It's a dramatic rendering of the architecture here. It's also a quite complex architectural setting, lots of different areas. You can see the pinnacles on top, and the tracery within these are recalling the Gothic architecture in Venice. You see spectators sprinkled throughout the space, some down here, a few up above looking down at what's taking place in the middle. So many of them are observing it, but others are doing their own thing, like this group over here to the right. It's hard to even tell what's going on with them. Now at the very top, you've got something different. You've got a related scene to the Dormition of the Virgin, so the dead Virgin lying here, but up above, what you actually see is Christ seated in this halo of angels, and he's holding the soul of the Virgin. And in images of this period, the soul of the Virgin is almost always shown as a swaddled baby. So it's this interesting play on the traditional Virgin and child images that we're used to seeing. The vantage point of the viewer is clearly marked out with the architectural setting and exactly where we're supposed to look, but notice that that seated figure of Christ at the top doesn't fit into that scheme. So the story that's being told, for the most part, is put into the perspectival scheme, but it doesn't work with this heavenly apparition up above. And I just wanted to show you one other example from his sketchbook. Here we have another biblical scene. We have the Sermon of St. John the Baptist. He's standing on this very classicizing piece of architecture set in a classicizing archway here, almost like a triumphal arch from ancient Rome, and then a quite Venetian looking cityscape. Here we've got a little bit more emphasis on the figures involved in the story, but again, he's really interested in developing his skills at linear perspective, which again is a Central Italian preoccupation. Jacopo Bellini also created more traditional altarpieces. So earlier Renaissance altarpieces sometimes just show devotional images. The one we're seeing here is referred to as the triptych of St. Sebastian. So the triptych refers to the fact that it's in 3 separate panels here. And we see St. Sebastian in the very center. He's very easy to distinguish because he's always shot through with arrows. And then at the very top, you see God the Father giving a sign of blessing, and the saints seem to be looking up towards him for the most part. And in the background, you see a scene of an annunciation with the angel Gabriel coming in to tell the Virgin Mary that she will soon be with child. It's interesting here that Bellini is giving this some sense of continuous setting among the 3 separate planes. You can see that the background is continuous, but his use of the gold leaf is quite Byzantine, really flattening out the space. So the combination of the golden background with the illusionistic, naturalistic setting down below is kind of at odds with one another. But this is a very traditional sort of altarpiece in the early Renaissance in Venice. I'd now like to turn to Jacopo's best-known son, Giovanni Bellini, and this is his work referred to as the San Giobbe altarpiece because it came from that church of San Giobbe in Venice, and it dates to before 1478. And this is oil on wooden panel. It's found today in a museum rather than the church itself. And you can really get a sense of the state of the panel just by looking at this painting. If you look at all these horizontal lines crossing it, those are all the different boards that are joined together, and those joins have started coming through the paint here. This is a really good example of the quality of light and color that you see in Venetian painting. We see Giovanni using a very sensuous color system, and it carries this very luminous quality. So you've got this strong light coming in from the exterior of the painting. It looks to be mostly coming in from the right side here. And you can see the use of gold leaf being used to pick out the mosaic in the background and some gilding in the coffers of the ceiling. So the setting that he's given to this altarpiece is really rather a combination of classicizing architecture, especially in this barrel vault with the inlaid coffers, the frieze that runs all the way around, and these pilasters with grotesques and composite capitals at the top. But then in the background, you have what's very Venetian, and that is this depicted mosaic here. Very, very typically Venetian. This is another example of what we've looked at several times so far, the Sacra Conversazione, where we have saints from different time periods together. And this was very common in devotional images and very popular, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. Giovanni Bellini is especially famous for his Madonnas and his Sacra Conversaziones. The use of color and light here is very harmonious and balanced, and it lends a feeling of calmness and stillness to this painting. So I think it appears that everything is just at a perfect standstill, But if you start looking at the details, you can start to get a sense that there's more going on here, and maybe it's not as still and calm as you think. So we see a seated virgin and child enthroned here, raised up higher than the saints around them. This is quite typical, and to me is especially Venetian, the way that it's presented. They're seated in what looks like the apse of the church with the mosaic here, and you see the colored marble in the background, which Venice is very famous for that. Around them are various saints. We have Sebastian again, shot through with arrows. The other very prominent saint here is Saint Francis. He should be recognizable to you as well. The other almost nude saint over here is Saint Job, which is the Old Testament figure Job and what San Giobbe translates to in Italian. So there's a very sensuous quality to these two nearly nude figures. And then finally, at the very bottom, you see this little orchestra of angels. So you can, if you try to imagine, you might get a sense that there's music playing in this very sacred gathering of figures. We see Giovanni Bellini being very interested in perspective, just like his father. And the way that the frame of this altarpiece worked, it really looked like it was continuing the space of this chapel, sort of like Masacci's Trinity, if you think about that painting, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And the pilasters in the painting especially recall the frame, so it really looks like this architectural extension of the physical space of the chapel. So one way that Venetian artists were able to attain this glowing sense of color, as I mentioned, that grinding above glass happens sometimes, but also they would apply their paint, and they're using oil paint much earlier on than Central Italian artists are. They apply this in very thin glazes. That's one of the advantages of oil paint, is that it can be applied very thinly, it can be reworked, and the glazes are these nearly translucent layers of paint. And so to have that many layers of paint would add to this luminous quality, that light would move through these different layers, reflecting back various colors. So this is a great example of 15th century Venetian painting. One of Giovanni Bellini's most famous paintings, it's actually in the US, is this one called St. Francis in the Desert. And this dates about the same time as the San Giobbe altarpiece, although we don't have a really secure date for this. Here we see him using oil and tempera paint on a wooden panel. So even though the Venetians often use canvas, they do use panels sometimes, and they do use tempera paint as well. That is a pigment mixed with an egg yolk as the binder. What we're seeing here is in the very center, St. Francis, who is in the middle of receiving the stigmata. We see him stepping forward. He's been sitting in this little workspace up on this mountain in Italy where the stigmata was said to have taken place. You can see that he's been at study, contemplating life and death, mortality. He's got a prayer book here. His shoes have been left behind, and he's walking towards the light that comes in from the left side of the painting. He has his arms outstretched, looking upward towards heaven. And you can start to see the break in the sky, like it's about to happen, like the stigmata, the angel is going to come flying down and pierce him with the wounds of Christ. This was said to have happened in 1224 during a retreat that he took to Mount Alverna in the Apennine Mountains outside of Assisi. And so it seems to be this event that Bellini is evoking through the naturalistic yet transcendental imagery, with the rays of light flooding the foreground from an unseen source at the upper left. But at the same time, there is no angel flying in, and he does not have any wounds right now. So perhaps he's not evoking that. So some alternative explanations for the scene have been proposed. The wilderness, or the desert as it seems more appropriate here, of Mount Alverna is compared in early Franciscan sources to the desert of the book of Exodus, specifically that Moses and Aaron were crossing. Then they were seen by the Franciscans as their spiritual ancestors. And there was also a parallel scene between Francis's stigmatization and Moses' communion with God on Mount Horeb. You see this sort of quivering tree at the upper left, shining in this mysterious light source, which may then be intended to also recall not only the cross, but also the burning bush from the story of Moses. The landscape in the background here is filled with marvelous details. There's all sorts of animals. We see this donkey most clearly, but you can see more in the background, birds, and there's also people, plants, and objects. along with some strange rock formations that have yielded hidden meanings for those who understood their importance in Franciscan literature. So Bellini is very familiar with this Franciscan literature and the creation of this work. So one example that I can give as to some of these symbolic readings is over here to the left. You see the spout. There's water trickling from it, and that is compared to the miraculous fountain that Moses brought forth from the rocks at Mount Horeb also. And the empty sandals that Francis is shown as having abandoned here recall God's command to Moses to take off his shoes on this holy ground. So all of this together adds up to this really strong sense of significance through the radiant light flowing over the landscape, through the gesture and the forward stepping Moses, that it has a kind of a magical charge to it. And it has a real impact when you see it in person. It's actually in the Frick collection in New York. And we see here Giovanni Bellini exploiting fully the luminous quality of oil paint. Giovanni Bellini also worked in official capacities, and here I'm showing you a work done for the Doge named Agostino Barbarigo. And we see the Doge in his very characteristic garments and Doge's cap. This is always what a Doge's crown looks like, with this little horn at the back. And this was a work that Agostino Barbarigo commissioned for the Doge's palace from Giovanni Bellini. In this period in Venice, there is at work some limitations on the power of the Doge, but that didn't necessarily stop him from some self-glorification, as we can see with a votive picture here, but with the portrait of the Doge here. And this is a commission to be hung in the state offices in the Doge's palace. Agostino was the second of two Barbarigo Doges in a row. He succeeded his brother Marco. And this is a seemingly humble image of the Doge kneeling in front of the enthroned Virgin and Child. Not really that different than the San Giove altarpiece, for example. So up on a throne, she's got this high backing, this canopy over her head, and this curtain that seems like it could be pulled even further across the back of the painting. She's surrounded by angels playing musical instruments, and then you see these little seraphim up here, these little heads floating on clouds. Back behind the curtains, you see this rather beautiful landscape, and this is very typical of Venetian paintings, where there's just a hint of the outdoor world, that this might be taking place outside. We see Agostino Barbarigo, as I've mentioned, over here piously kneeling before the Virgin in the ceremonial costume of the Doge. And what's interesting is, instead of his name saint presenting him, St. Augustine, which is what Agostino translates to, we have St. Mark presenting him. Remember, St. Mark is the patron saint of Venice. Across the canvas and a little bit in shadow, we see St. Augustine, the name saint of the Doge. So there's some dynastic associations being presented, because remember, Mark is the name of his brother, and also the patron of the city, and his brother is the one presenting him to the Virgin. So he's connecting himself to the city, but also to his brother. Throughout the painting, you see this serene and suffused light. And again, I want to emphasize this bringing the scene out of an interior and into the landscape, which is very, very typical of Venetian painting at this time. But in the background here, we see more of a country landscape with just a few hints of buildings, rather than showing something like a Venetian cityscape. There are some classicizing elements, especially if you look at the balustrade behind the figures. You see this grotesques depicted on the balusters here. I wanted to show you just a few more paintings by Giovanni before I move on to talk about his brother Gentili Bellini, not quite as famous as Giovanni, but another very important painter and son of Jacopo Bellini. So here I'm showing you what's a very naturalistic portrait done of another Doge. This one is Leonardo Loredan, and we see him wearing, again, the ceremonial garments that we just saw with Agostino Barbarigo, this beautiful Doge's crown that he's wearing with that horn. And hopefully you notice this beautiful damask cloth that he's wearing. It looks lavish and very, very expensive, and it's echoed in the fabric of his crown as well. Venice had access to all sorts of lavish materials, and the Doge was always from a very wealthy family, so he could afford some of the most beautiful fabrics around. Bellini presents him just behind this ledge, and like in many of his paintings, he includes this little piece of paper, which is referred to as a cartellino, a little sheet, basically, where we have his signature. It says Joannus Bellinus, which is the Latin form of his name. And it's this interesting way of marking the painting as his own, But the cartellino also marks the surface of the painting. So it's kind of a way of breaking this fourth wall, this intimate, the space where the painting meets the viewer. We don't even have Loredon looking out towards us, he's looking out somewhere else. But to me, this is a really good painting showing Giovanni's ability to create this really naturalistic portrait. I mean, he almost looks alive in front of us. You can see the deep lines of his face. And while this is maybe somewhat idealized, I mean, it really shows this old man. And the Doge was always an old man. And it's very evocative. You get a really good sense of this figure, and I think you could imagine him walking down the street. And just to show you a couple of other very characteristic scenes of Giovanni, here we have a Pietà. Remember, this is not a very popular Italian subject, but we see it revived after Michelangelo executes his Pietà in Rome in the 1490s. Here we see Bellini setting his figures in front of a landscape, again, very, very typical of Venetian painters. You see the strong interest in color and light. Again, we have the light coming in from the outside of the painting. You've got this gorgeous blue drapery and this very reflective quality to all of the garments of the Virgin Mary. And once again, he's signed to the painting down here. So there's a sense of naturalism, but it's not the same sort of naturalism that you see in the Central Italian paintings. Here's another one of his Madonna and Child. I mean, quite similar to a Pietà, actually. Anytime you see a Madonna and Child where the baby is asleep, it's supposed to recall these images of the Pietà. Again, he set them out into the landscape. There's nothing really separating them from us or them from this farm background. So it's a very interesting depiction of the Virgin and Child. She's dressed in a much more dignified manner than the livestock or the peasants in the background. But it's a way of showing that devotional images are for everyone. And then finally, here's another very good example of one of his Madonna and Childs, again set in front of a landscape, again signed, which you see down here, dated to 1510. But here he has put up what's called a cloth of honor, separating the Virgin and Child from this more humble background. He hasn't separated them from us this time, which is very interesting. They're very accessible to us. And I just wanted to show you a couple examples of Gentile Bellini's painting. I'm going to show you his most famous work here, and this is a work called The Procession of the Relic of the True Cross in the Piazza San Marco, dating to 1496. So Gentile is working in a style that's very much like his contemporary Carpaccio, who unfortunately we don't have time to talk about in this course, but they're painting in what's referred to very often as a descriptive mode. So being very careful to represent all details as accurately as possible in order to give the image a sense of authority. So this was one of a series of paintings commissioned for the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista, and I pointed that out on the map before. And this scuola, or school in English, is one of several very important groups. They're sort of like confraternities in Venice. So a group of, maybe they share a similar profession, maybe they're from a similar neighborhood. In Venice, they're more hodgepodge in terms of their membership, but they actually have quite a bit of power in the city. And in any civic procession, which took place many, many times a year, the Scuola Grandi, especially there were 5 Scuola Grandi, big schools. They were the ones in charge of organizing these processions and filling the space of the piazza, which is what we see going on here. And then there's dozens of scuole piccoli, the little schools, that didn't have quite as much power as something like that of San Giovanni Evangelista. In the late 15th and 16th century, we see the scuole building new meeting houses where they could hold their meetings, they could have area for devotional spaces. We see them commissioning a lot of artworks to decorate these spaces. And this is one of a series that Bellini does for the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista, one of a series of narrative paintings used to decorate their meeting rooms. Often these narrative paintings refer to miracles associated with relics that they held, which is what is going on here. So if you looked at this, you might just think it's this portrait almost of the Basilica of San Marco, and there is the Doge's palace in the background, as we saw before, and you see this huge procession of people. You see this canopy, this baldachin being carried in the center here, not quite perfectly, because how likely is it that it would be perfectly straight? You see other members of the confraternity carrying candlesticks, and then lots of people watching the procession. But in fact, what's going on here is a miracle associated with the relic being carried under this baldachin. So the relic of the true cross was kept in this container. And what we're being shown here is this miracle that occurred in 1444, where a child who was ill was miraculously cured when his father knelt in adoration of the relic. And you see this figure kneeling right here, meant to recall that miracle of 1444. And this is the moment that his child, who isn't in Venice at this time, when the child was miraculously cured. So as I said, this is an incredibly descriptive work, and in many ways it tells us more about contemporary Venice than the miracle that is the true subject of the work. And the description paid attention to the site is a way of verifying the actual event that took place, because we all know that the Piazza San Marco exists. We all know it looks exactly like this. And so therefore it must have happened exactly in this way at this time in this setting. Now, one of the other really interesting things about this painting, and I've worked with this painting in my own studies sometimes, because it shows us what the Basilica of San Marco looked like at the very end of the 15th century. There's lots of changes that take place to the Basilica over the course of the centuries, as late as the 18th century. And one of the major changes that takes place is the facade mosaic. So if you look in these lunettes, these little semicircular shapes, you see different mosaics picked out here. And I love the way that Bellini has presented the gold leaf of them. They really do look like mosaics, depicted very differently than everything around here. Now, if I go back to an image of San Marco the way it looks today, you can see, hopefully you can see, that the mosaics of the lunettes have been replaced, at least these four. The only one that survives is the one on the far left, which I'm showing you here now. So this is a mosaic on the far left of the facade, which actually, it's very interesting, shows us what the basilica looked like in the 12th century. We see another procession taking place. Here it seems to be the burial of the body of St. Mark, which occurred in the 9th century, but it's being shown in the 12th or the 13th century here. And we see all these Venetians gathered, very much like Bellini's own painting. So because we see how closely Bellini's mosaic in the painting matches the one that still survives, this is regularly used as a way to verify what these mosaics looked like, and they're mosaics telling the story of the bringing of the body of St. Mark from Alexandria to Venice. So Venetians are very interested in their city in all of their depictions. I also wanted to show you a portrait that Gentili Bellini painted of the Sultan Mahomet II in 1480. Now remember, Vasari tells us about Gentili's trip to Constantinople and how his works were very favored there by the Sultan. I find this to be a really interesting portrait. It's not quite as naturalistic as, say, Giovanni's image of Doge Leonardo Loredan. You do have some sort of sfumato effects on the face here. It's almost like we're looking at a picture of a portrait, the way that the Sultan has been framed. Like his brother Giovanni, he puts the Sultan behind a ledge here. He frames him with this all'antica classicizing arch. You see the grotesque of the pillars here. And he almost looks like he's painted very differently than the setting, and especially from this amazing cloth in front of him that you can see is covered in pearls and various jewels. And the very descriptive pictorial style of the Bellini really is perfect for the rendering of the way the light would hit these individual gems and pearls. So it's an interesting approach, a different rendering of the portrait compared to the descriptive nature of the architectural setting and the decorative details. So it's just a way to remind you also that Gentile is the one who traveled pretty extensively into the Byzantine Empire, and that probably impacted the way he presented several different subjects in his paintings. Before I move on to the artist Giorgione, I want to show you one more work by Giovanni Bellini, a very famous painting that's now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So if you're in D.C., I highly recommend going to see it. It's actually a painting that works much better in person than it does in a reproduction. This is a work commissioned from Bellini by a duke named Alfonso d'Este, who was in charge of the city of Ferrara. And this was done for a room called a studiolo, a sort of office space that was semi-public. And Alfonso Studiolo was completely decorated in marble. And what we see him doing here by commissioning a work like this, and then he commissioned several other scenes from mythology, specifically from Titian, he was trying to outdo other Italian rulers at the time who were also commissioning rooms like this. This is very classicizing, even more so than Giovanni's other works, in its subject and in its forms. Bellini was only able to finish one painting before his death, and then the rest of the cycle of scenes from the gods are executed by Titian and another painter named Dosso Dossi, who both actually work on this canvas as well. This is a painting done when Giovanni Bellini was quite old, and what we see is the gathering of the gods and goddesses for the winter solstice. So we see a couple of different couples being depicted here that are sort of centerpieces in this scene. Seated at the center, you see the figures of Neptune and a nature goddess. We know this is Neptune, the god of the sea, because he has this trident laid down right next to him. And this image of Neptune is actually a portrait of Alfonso d'Este. You also have the figures of Ceres and Apollo seated right here. And Ceres is the goddess of nature, and Apollo is the god of music and poetry and many other things as well. And then finally, the third couple that you see here is Priapus and Lotus. So Lotus is the sleeping nymph, and Priapus is just about to unveil her so he can see a little bit more of her body. And Priapus is enjoying himself very much. If you look at the center of his drapery, you can see that he's becoming excited by what is taking place. And then in the background, you see a variety of figures associated with Bacchus. You see these satyrs and this mule and this large barrel of wine that everybody is drinking from. So it's this beautiful feast where all of these different gods, nymphs, and goddesses have gathered. In fact, we see Bacchus as the one who's filling up this jug of wine, and his attendant Silenus is very close by. Unfortunately, he's not depicted in more detail because Silenus is one of my favorite mythological figures. And what's interesting is it's thought that this is supposed to be depicting this moment where the donkey right here is about to bray and wake Lotus up to save her from the leering eyes of Priapus. Originally, this was a very different composition, and Bellini filled the whole background with a screen of trees, very much like what you see on the right side here, but Dosso and Titian both came in and modified it. It's done in an older mode of painting, and it really didn't fit in with the newest developments of Titian, which we will talk about in our next module. So now I want to turn to the work of Giorgione, and let me give you just a little bit of background on Venice in the 16th century. It was politically tumultuous for Venice this period of time. They had some difficulty with some of their mainland holding. They had several different wars going on, especially against what's called the League of Cambrai, which was a union of the Papal States, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of France, and Milan, because they didn't like how much power Venice had. We do see, though, through this a continued interest in the artistic styles of the past, despite the fact that times were tough. We do see new styles still emerging that are more evocative and ambiguous, especially with the work of someone like Giorgione. And one of the major innovations of this period is something called poesia, which is the idea that painting is meant to operate in the manner of poetry. Here I'm showing you one of Giorgione's earlier works. In many ways, Giorgione's style recalls that of Leonardo, especially with the use of sfumato, but we see some very Venetian characteristics as well. The landscape is done in this naturalistic mode that's much more Venetian, much more like the Bellini than what we see Leonardo doing, for example. And this fact of putting these three philosophers out in nature is also very typically Venetian. What's interesting about Giorgione's works, though, is they often sort of defy serious explanation. Why are these three philosophers in the wilderness? What three philosophers are they? This one seems to be drawing. He's got this T-square of sorts that he's using, but what is he looking at? What exactly is he doing? And so there's a lot of ambiguities present in the works of Giorgione. I want to talk in some detail about three works by this artist. The first is this one called The Tempest. So Giorgione is a student of Giovanni Bellini, so we should see some characteristics carried over from the style that we were just talking about. But this work is very strange and can best be described as enigmatic. The name that we give it, the Tempest, is named for the storm that you see in the background. But really what's going on here, it's the figures that catch the viewer's attention. We see three figures overall, the man at the left side here and the woman seated at the right with a child whom she's breastfeeding. The figures are moved to the sides and they don't make much sense within the landscape, and they don't make much sense with each other either. Scholars have attempted to identify several different meanings of this painting from myth, from the Bible, etc., and it has really been elusive. It's got very evocative color, form, and light that are all part of this intrigue. It's very characteristic of the visual style of Venetian painting and of this innovation that I mentioned, poesia. Originally, we know from studies, from scientific studies of this painting, that on the side where the soldier figure is, and he's not exactly a soldier, come to think of it, there used to be another nude female. It's hypothesized that the woman on the right who is breastfeeding may be representative of the idea of charity, because as an allegorical figure, charity is often shown breastfeeding in order to nourish. But there is a lot of ambiguity. It's likely not a commission, since he changed some of the major features of the painting as he worked. But does it have to do with war? One of the strange things about this, though, if it's not a commission, is that in the buildings in the background, a couple of the different buildings have coats of arms of various families, including from the famous Venetian Vendramine family. So why would he paint their arms there if they weren't the patrons? Does it have some other meaning? Does it have to do with war? Why is this man looking towards her? Is he a soldier? What is he wearing? His garments don't really give any indication as to his status. What's going on in this landscape? What is with the ruins on the left side, sort of classicizing architecture that's completely falling apart? But the landscape is very similar to earlier Venetian paintings that we've already seen. So with this work, we can see the birth of visual poetry, this emphasis on the ability of painting to tell a poetic story. So maybe there isn't a definitive meaning necessarily. And here's just a detail. You can actually see the Vendramine coat of arms on the building here, and that lightning cutting through the painting that gives this work its name, the Tempest. Here's another detail so you can see the painting style of Giorgione. It's kind of hazy. He uses some swift brush strokes to create these blades of grass, but then it's a bit looser. It's a bit more loosely handled in her hair, in the skin, and in the other greenery around her. The next work I'd like to talk about is a very important work in the tradition of the female nude in art. The female nude is probably the most prolific subject in the entire history of art, and this is a very important moment for the rise of female nudes in the 16th century. This is a very sensual subject matter, and it does have some connections to classicism. So this is called a sleeping Venus, but really we don't have any indication of who she might be. So one of the ways to justify a nude figure like this was to call her Venus, that she is the goddess of love, and so it makes sense for her to be nude. Also, it's very interesting that she's shown sleeping, because it makes her the passive recipient of the viewer's gaze here. Originally, this work also had a Cupid figure, which was over near her feet, which helped to better define the subject of this, but it's been painted out. We see in the body of Venus this idealized female form. She's got a long and continuous slope of the body, and her arm is thrown up around her head, very much like some surviving examples of antique sculpture, which is a sign that she is sleeping. So yes, her eyes closed are definitely one, but there's this very famous sculpture actually in the Vatican museums today of the sleeping Ariadne, and she has her arm up very much like that. The landscape in the background, again, very typically Venetian, especially putting her out in the landscape like this. It's very reminiscent of the curves of her body, the way that the land rises in these gently sloping hills. And you can see that Giorgione here is even including some atmospheric perspective to give a sense of depth to this painting overall. There have been some associations between this name Venus and the city of Venice. Those words sound very similar, and they do in Italian as well. And it's interesting to show her in the landscape right at a time, and it's interesting to show Venus in a landscape right at the time that Venice is busy defending their land holdings in the mainland of Italy. In many ways, this does not resemble nudes from antiquity. It's much more erotic, and it very much looks like a contemporary woman who has just taken off her clothes. Look at the drapery she's lying on, these almost satin-looking garments, and this looks like a large cloak that would go over her, or maybe this is her dress, but these fabrics are very much what contemporary women in Venice would have been wearing. So another thing that we have to talk about, and it's always easier to talk about this in a classroom rather than an online lecture, but we have to talk about what's going on with her other hand. We've talked about her arm thrown up around her head, but what about that following the contours of her body and resting right in between her legs? One theory about why this is so provocative, why her hand is shown in this specific location in almost an active motion, that's not a completely relaxed hand, is that there were some gynecological treatises published at this time that said that masturbation actually promoted fertility. So images of a nude were often associated with marriages. Think back to Botticelli's image of the birth of Venus, for example. And remember, the major priority of marriage is to create a line for a noble family. So it's thought that this might be a marriage painting. And as I said, it's the beginning of a long tradition of reclining female nudes. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Titian. The last work I want to show you today is this one, often referred to as that pastoral scene or the pastoral concert, or its French name is Concession Pet. And this is a work that has been really difficult for scholars to securely attribute. Many say it's Giorgione, some say it's Titian, some say it's both. The debate really rages on. Titian is a student of Giorgione, and they do seem to have collaborated some time. This is an interesting painting, another good example of poesia. It's painting as poetry because it's not a real clear subject matter here either. We have a lot of pastoral references taking place, such as their setting in the landscape, this series of buildings here in the background, and then down on the right side you've got a shepherd and his flock, which is absolutely pastoral. We also have an interesting play of opposites going on. So there are two clothed men, one very clearly shown as a nobleman by his dress, the other is shown as a more rustic figure. His hair is a little unkempt, there's no cap, his clothing is much more rough than his companions, his foot is bare in the landscape. And then you have two nude women, so in complete opposition to these clothed men. There seems to be a romantic reference to pastoral antiquity here. So there's some music going on. We see the nobleman in the middle of playing this lute. We see one of the women whose back is completely to us. She's got this pipe in her hand. The other woman is at this large fountain, at this basin, pouring water into it. There's quite a few private interactions going on that are hidden from the viewer, especially between the men. They even seem to ignore the women to a certain extent. It's a very interesting use of paint. It's rather loosely handled, especially for this time period, and it seems that Giorgione and or Titian is happy to leave evidence of the artist's hand on the canvas. This is a new idea of what painting is, that the artist is present in the work. As I mentioned already, a precise subject is avoided once again, just like our Sleeping Venus and the Tempest. But there's lots of allusions available for the viewer, just like in poetry, so you can sort of construct your own narrative here. It's a very good example that demonstrates the Renaissance interest in humanism and the ancient. So these nude figures, casually draped, sitting in a landscape, should recall some poetry from classical antiquity. We see Giorgione using a very soft atmosphere. Again, he's using sfumato to blur the edges of the figures into the landscape so there are no harsh outlines. And it's rather hazy and enigmatic. So a lot of unknowns about Giorgione. There's a lot of intriguing questions that his work and biography raise, and we really don't know much about his biography either. So he's a fascinating artist to look at, and there's so much more that art historians would like to know about him. So I will leave the lecture there for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot about the Bellini and Giorgione. Now you are responsible for taking the self-assessment quiz and for completing the rest of the work in the module, the discussion board, and the second part of your writing assignment. So thank you for watching, and I will see you for Module 9.